So for instance, you get the story in Genesis 11 of the Tower of Babel. Okay? And I have it here on the next slide. We'll come back to it in a second. Just bear with me one second. The whole world had one language and the same words. As they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain, the land of Shinar, and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them together." Mud bricks, right? And so they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower with its top into the heavens." Why? "And let us make a name for ourselves," right? Traditionally, it's men, and they like to build these strong, pointy structures up into this, and we can't ever figure out if they want to be like God or if they just want to be very fertile, right? These very phallic structures. And I'll let you, obelisks and pyramids and Eiffel Towers, and right? Men have this tradition of compensating, let's say. Okay? And let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered around the tower that they blah, 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 blah. So the idea was they wanted to be up into the heavens. So they wanted to build a tower. By the way, I like this story because God says what? The Lord came down and saw the city, and he says, look, they're one people, they have one language. This is the beginning. If they do it, let's confuse their language so they will not understand one another's speech. Basically, God in the story says they can actually build a tower. He concedes they could build a tower up into heaven. So we better knock it down and scatter them out. What is this story doing, by the way? Doing two things. One, it's an etiology. E-T-I-O-L-O, etiology. An etiology, and there's lots of them, and I'll try to point them out in the Bible. An etiology is an attempt to explain a naturally occurring phenomenon. An etiology is an attempt to explain some kind of naturally occurring phenomenon. So for instance, after it rains, you see a big rainbow, right? And an ancient Semitic person wandering around there in the Near East would say, "Daddy," or "Abba," "what's that?" And he'd say, "Well, that's a rainbow." And he says, "Well, what is that?" And he says, "Well, it happens after it rains." "Well, why is it raining?" This is what I told my daughter, right? "Why is it raining?" And I said, "Well, God is crying." And he says, "Why is God crying?" I said, "I don't know, probably something you did, though." And no. I didn't do that. It's funny, though. The idea was people would look at natural phenomena like a rainbow, and they'd say, "What is that?" Right? And what they couldn't do at the time was say, well, if you've ever seen the cover of a Pink Floyd album, when light enters into a prism, it naturally refracts into the different spectral colors. They didn't know science. They didn't do that, right? They didn't know that raindrops, precipitation in the air, act as a prism to split up light, and we get rainbows from a visible spectrum of color. They didn't know that. So what they did instead was they tried to answer naturally occurring phenomenon with stories that they did understand, that usually conveyed some kind of cultural or ethical or moral value about who we are as a people and how we ought to act. So instead of hearing stories about refractive prisms and light and stuff, "What's that rainbow?" the father would say, "Let me tell you a story. One time God got really, really upset at people, and so he just said, I regret having made people. Oops." And he flooded the earth and killed them all, except for this one guy, and he built a boat, and he saved some people and got all the animals, and then God promised he would never destroy, he would never sow such an act of destruction again using water, and so he put a bow. He put a bow in the sky, basically, to promise he would never. And you get the story of the Tower of Babel is an etiological explanation for how you got multiple languages. Why? Why do you need an explanation for multiple languages? Because the reality of the world was people spoke lots of different languages. You didn't understand everybody, and yet you have another story in Genesis 1 that says what? God created Adam and Eve. And one would assume that they spoke the same language. So how did you get from two people on earth speaking the same language to a little few more people on earth speaking all these different languages? The Tower of Babel. And what do they communicate? You know what? You shouldn't try to be like God. You shouldn't try to reach up into the heavens. You should not try to make a name for yourself. And so you get the Tower of Babel.